I've wet the paper all over with plain water, and now I'm going to set about adding my colour into the sky. So you'll probably lose the drawing a little bit. Don't worry about that. It was quite loose in the first place. So leave some gaps where the light is coming through a little bit more, definitely towards the centre there. And then we'll be painting on top of this with the woods, so don't worry about the colour going over the whole area. So it will dry quite a lot lighter. So just keep remembering that there's that light in the centre that you're trying to keep. So I'm using a large flat wash brush to cover as much ground as possible. So that brings me down to the horizon, then I'm going to work now below, bringing a little bit of that colour down, but then starting to introduce some of the green into this, but still keeping an overall cool blue tinge to it all. There is a little bit of snow, I think, laying on the floor there, so a few little white patches won't hurt. And this is basically our ground that we're going to work on top of. I'm going to keep building the colour up. So in between stages we're going to let it dry a little bit, possibly trying to go back into it while it's just a touch wet, so we get some bleeding images, which would be quite nice, quite a lot of softness on it. So I'm just trying to reflect some of this blue now into the ground. I may wait a few minutes and get it to dry just a little touch more. You can see it drying already, and see how this light area is drying. Probably get even lighter. It's still wet, so if you want to add anything else to that sky now, you can do, or you can just see what happens, let that dry. I'll show you what happens if you try to introduce it. It may push the colour a little bit down and create some shapes, but I'll show you what happens anyway if I add a little bit more strength of colour there. So let's just see what happens if I put something here. Just looking at the areas that may show through the trees more than other bits. So we'll just see what happens with that. May work, may not, may just push the colour a little bit more than I want, but got to try. So I've let this dry for about 5 minutes, and now I'm going to go into it again. It's still quite wet, just to bring in some of those other colours that we were talking about. So we've got a hillside here, so I'm going to start to bring in some of the burnt umber and reds. Just let that sit and give me a bit of a backdrop here to work with. Similarly on this side. Just going to start pushing the colour around, but that's what we're interested in really. And then just see where the colour sits in the rest of the image. It looks to me like we've got some darker sepia and umber going on here. So again, just remember this is just a soft backdrop to these sharper images that we're going to be drawing in later for the trees. Just think about the colour of the size of the brush that you're using. So just keep working at this whilst it's semi-wet, and then you'll get a nice soft tones blending into the next and pushing some of that colour away. Just adding some of that sepia that's got the red tones into it, just to warm up that area here. There's certain sections that we imagine that the light is hitting more than others, and that will be the warmer tones, and the things that remain in shadow will be much bluer in tone. So where I'm imagining the light is hitting a little more, I'll be introducing the warmer tones. I've just redrawn some of these trees in just so that I can see a little bit more clearly where I think I'm going to put those. So I'm going to get those in next because I feel that I want to create some structure before I do any more shadows or anything. So I'm keeping a nice loose brush stroke here, and I'm going to work into those shapes nice and loosely. So the ones that are closer to where the sun is coming through, I'll have a warmer brown, and then I'll go to a cooler brown towards the edges or on the shadow side of the trunk of these ones here. So that's quite a warm brown at the moment here. And then I'll put some blue into that brown in this sort of way to bring that onto the left hand side here, and I'll work in that way across the piece. So I'm going to try my best to stay nice and loose and free with it all, not get too laboured, which is easier said than done, but give it a go. Sometimes I'm actually sitting down, but it might be better to stand up, get a bit of a distance between me and the work. So just keep on going until I have the structure in. And then I can start to play around again with shadows and soft tones. Just keep on going like this for a little bit. So I'm going to try and create a few shadow shapes coming here with a broader brush and some blue in the mix of greens and browns, just to give that cool feeling. Just try and be, it's quite hard, try and be quite free with your shapes that you're making, quite broad shapes. and then add some plain water just to blend a little. Finding standing up is giving me that little bit more freedom with the brush strokes. I'm just going to let that dry. Okay, back to working in to create some loose shape and form, the texture of these and this undergrowth and foliage that you've got here. So it's just a suggestion. See if you can follow the lines of the shadows a little bit, follow it up to the base of the tree where the shadow's coming. So every time I'm mixing, I'm making sure that there's blue in the mix to give a feeling of cool sort of colourway. So I'm doing things like wetting a little first, plain water, then bringing in some strength of colour here, kind of working its way down. Smaller marks here at the top, get to some larger marks. So it's quite abstract, this foreground. I'm going to tidy the whole thing up by working back into those trees a little bit. So it all depends on areas of wet and areas of dry as to whether or not it finishes with a hard line or a soft line. So if you get lost with your colour, just go back to your little colour swatch that you made, just to keep yourself back on track with the colours that you said you were going to use, rather than reaching for some separate colours which might make the whole thing look a little bit disjointed. We're sticking to our palette. This is what it's about really this time, which is sticking to the colours that you decided were a good representation for your image. So I'm trying to channel through with some of these shadows here. It's a real fine balance between being too hard and too soft. So I'm trying to stay loose like the inspiration. Easier said than done, I know. Not easy. Looking a bit plain here. So I'm just going to get a little bit more texture in certain areas. And then I'm going to assess it really and see if I'm happy about where the light is falling. So I need this central section here to be lighter than the edges. So if that means drying it and going back into the edges to add a little bit more colour here in order for this to look lighter, and that's what I'll do. So I've just added a little bit of splatter effect, just knocking the brush on the top of the brush with your finger, just tapping it and getting the splatters in there. And again, we'll see how that dries.